I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we analyse the latest updates from Ukraine and ask what the fall of Luhansk means for Ukraine and Russia.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Tuesday, the 5th of July, day 132, and today I'm joined by the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor Dominic Nicholls, Senior Foreign Correspondent Roland Oliphant, and Assistant Comment Editor Francis Dearnley. I started by asking Dom and Francis for news from the front lines across Ukraine.
Yeah, hi David, hi everybody. I apologise if there's any background noise. I'm at a conference today, the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps on multi-domain operations in the urban environment. So if you hear a lot of noise, apologies, that's it. But updates from the last 24 hours, kind of big to small really. So Sweden and Finland have formally signed the NATO accession protocol. This is the next formal step, well, the last formal step on their part to join NATO. What it means is that they are now formally able to join NATO meetings. They'll have access to more intelligence, but they're not yet covered by the Article 5 mutual defence clause. However, you may remember that Britain extended a sort of bilateral defence agreement with the two countries some months ago. So it's just only a formal step now, I think, for Sweden and Finland join NATO. Separately, there's a lot of data, mainly from NASA, very interestingly, that there's a huge amount of fire, probably artillery fire, almost certainly artillery fire, behind the Russian lines in the Kherson area, and that's particularly interesting. We've been looking at it quite recently and saying that there's this sort of uprising, if you like, this led by the population in Kherson against Russian rule. We've also seen that Ukraine have been able to knit together a number of small counter-offensives in the area. So Kherson seems to be possibly the front to watch in the next few days, and it comes as Russia has said that one of their FSB, their security services, an official in the FSB who used to be the sort of second in command in Kaliningrad, he's now taken over the government of the sort of Moscow occupied Kherson region. And in a statement, they say Ukraine is forever in the past for the Kherson region. Russia is here forever. So they're pretty unequivocal. They're trying to turn Kherson into part of greater Russia, and we will see. We've seen in the past them try to do a sort of a vote on sovereignty there, which has come to nothing yet. But they are very clear that they're still pushing for to solidify their rule, if you like, in Kherson. Elsewhere, in response to the fall of Lysychansk yesterday, so Putin, we saw another excruciating video of Putin and Shoigu at the table discussing Lysychansk, and Putin was saying that the fighters that have been conducting the operation there, which he said mainly came from the central and southern groupings, they can rest. However, the other groupings must continue their advance. So the east and west groupings. Now, interestingly, him saying, and this is a quote from Putin, so the east and west groupings, quote, must carry out their tasks according to the previously approved plans, according to the single scheme, and I hope that everything will happen in their directions in the same way it has happened in Luhansk. So interestingly, the previously approved plans and this single scheme that we've been witness to seems to be smash the place up with artillery and then try and claim some sort of victory afterwards. So if that's what we can expect from the east and west groupings, who are in the north and the south on the northern southern flanks, so around Kharkiv to the north and Kherson in the south, if that's what's in store for the next phase, I think two things. Firstly, it shows that Russia's just out of ideas. It's got no great scheme here, no great plan, no great sort of initiative. No, they've not been able to respond to anything on the ground and come up with a better way of trying to achieve their objectives. They're just happy to grind on remorselessly, throwing their young men into the fray. They don't care for civilian infrastructure or civilian deaths. They're just content to grind on. But yeah, very unequivocal statement there from Putin, saying that he's content that what happened in Luhansk should happen elsewhere. So not great news. But on the other hand, Ukraine, knowing what your enemy is going to do is half the battle. So if that is what Russia are declaring, and that's what they've done so far, so there's no reason to suggest that they're suddenly going to develop some new operational art, then that in itself gives Ukraine an answer as to what to expect, and therefore they should be able to plan accordingly. But I'll just take a pause there.
Thank you very much, Dom. Francis, I know you've got quite a few updates, just some things we'd like to cover. Roland, Oliphant, however, would you like to just add anything to what Dom's been saying? I know you've been writing a lot about this recently.
Dom's basically right about how the Russians are playing this. It's a huge amount of artillery meant to compensate for not especially effective infantry operating on their own. But it's working. I don't think we should be complacent about this. People, including in Western capitals, will be watching what happened in Lysychansk. Okay, it's a tactical retreat. Okay, the Ukrainians avoided encirclement. Okay, it's taken 2-3 months for the Russians to effect this, but it's working, and they're still on the march. Unless the Ukrainians, backed by the West, can find a way to counter that artillery fire. I mean, I assume by interdicting the logistics chain for the ammunition, probably. We're likely to see a similar kind of thing in Donetsk, and I think, looking at the mood music from the Kremlin and from Moscow, the Russians seem to think, well, look, time is probably on our side, and if we keep going, maybe we're going to see, this kind of confidence on the side of the West begin to crumble, the unity begin to crumble. So I think that is the long-term game plan.
Thanks, Roland. We'll get on to your analysis in a few minutes, I'm sure. Francis Dearnley, can we pick up a couple of things that I think are important for our listeners to hear? There's been some development in the information space. Facebook and other social media firms are going to face multi-billion-pound fines if they fail to take down Kremlin disinformation under new laws. Can you tell us about this? Where is this? What's happening?
Yes, well, there's considerable talk about this since the war began here in the UK in relation to the online safety bill, and we now understand that there will be a new legal duty to proactively prevent and remove attempts by Russia and other hostile states to use websites like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and TikTok to mislead the public or interfere in the UK's political system. As I say, this is part of the government's plan to overhaul security laws and stop foreign interference. There would be a criminal offence with a maximum jail sentence of 14 years. And of course, this comes following Facebook and Twitter having already suspended dozens of accounts disseminating false information during the war. I mentioned the online safety bill. This is a controversial piece of legislation here in the UK, but just for the benefit of our international listeners, this is an attempt effectively by the government to try and control information online and provide, they would argue, more security. And this is now going to be one of the sort of central pillars of that, alongside child abuse, terrorism, revenge porn, fraud, promotion of people smuggling and sexual exploitation. As I say, not without controversy, but that's sort of a separate point. But yes, a very interesting story, and one that will no doubt have sort of be a cause of considerable debate, because of course, at what point does this in some way suppress elements of free speech? To what extent can one define somebody who perhaps expresses a pro-Russian view as being an agent of Russia? So it's obviously very difficult, and as I say, I'm sure there'll be considerable debate about that. Just one other area that you allude to in the information space. We understand that there's some regular Twitter users will be familiar with a celebrity Ukraine volunteer soldier account, and that has been exposed as a fraud by internet sleuths at Bellingcat and others. So this Canadian-Ukrainian volunteer was sort of a rather dashing fellow, wowing his thousands of Twitter followers with tales of his daring missions into enemy territory, describing sort of quite vividly frontline action. But considerable research has been done into this gentleman, and it's been proven that it's actually a fraud. And yes, at the height of his fame, he was publishing dozens of tweets a day to his 120,000 followers. And as I say, disinformation is rife on both sides. Obviously, much more present on the Russian side, I would argue. But there's still obviously evidence too of people who are trying to claim things that they're not. I'm not in any way insinuating that perhaps the Ukrainian government was in any way associated with this. It just speaks to the fact that information is a valuable commodity on Twitter, and there are those who are deceiving people as to what their real intentions are, but it's not surprise when, as we've talked about many times on this podcast, the information front, whether that be on social media or whether that be in mainstream news, is a major front in this war, and one that no doubt we'll talk about later today when Roland talks about his analysis and the long-term strategy for the West and for Ukraine in the war.
Thank you very much, Francis. Just one more thing I'd like to ask you. Oil and gas workers are on strike in Norway. This escalates Europe's natural gas crisis, and it's also a week before a key pipeline with Russia is going to be shut for maintenance. So this sort of economic story is bubbling away in the background. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yes, this story hasn't received much coverage, but I think it's an interesting one. So, as you say, oil and gas workers are on strike in Norway. This is escalating the natural gas crisis a week before one of the key Russian pipelines is due to shut for maintenance. Norway, I should say, supplies about 20 to 25% of the EU and UK's natural gas demand. And so it's concerning because it suggests that there is a sort of lack of European unity perhaps on this issue, I think there one element that perhaps hasn't been discussed as much as it perhaps should have been within the European Union is this question about certain sovereign nations providing energy support for others. We've talked about that a lot in the military space, but we haven't talked about it so much in the energy space. And of course, part of the reason for that is because whether it be Germany or Britain or France, everybody is facing struggles in this area. But I think it's quite concerning, and obviously this plays more to Moscow than it does to Brussels, Berlin, Paris or London, when you have people who are striking, and that will have a negative impact on the energy economy. So yes, I think that perhaps this will cause some concern, and there may well need to be some emergency plans long term for what to do if this issue gets worse. I mean, I should just add on relation to this that obviously Germany has now moved into the second stage of its three-stage emergency gas plan since Russia started slowing its supply. And I just, to speak to the seriousness of this, if they enter the third stage, then that is rationing of energy in Germany, and that would have enormous economic ramifications, contributing to job losses and the like. And so this is only the beginning of what could be a very, very serious crisis later on, particularly if Europe has a bad winter, and that will be one that will have ramifications not only in ones that we feel at home, but also have big impacts on the war, which is something I no doubt we'll want to cover shortly when we discuss the long-term picture.
Thank you very much, Francis. And yes, you're absolutely right. We'll definitely get on some of our business team, I think, later in the week to discuss what the near and far future looks like for European energy, because it's a key part of, I think, Moscow's long-term strategy in this invasion. Dom, Nicholls, I know you had some thoughts about some of the information news that Francis was relaying earlier. Would you like to come in and tell us it?
Yeah, so it strikes a chord with a lot of what's being spoken about today. So I'm in the Science Museum in central London for NATO's Allied Rapid Reaction Corps Multi-Domain Operations in the Urban Environment Conference. And it's basically talking about how to fight in urban centres. So if we look at what Russia's done for Mariupol, as well as many of the other cities, they've just smashed the place up. They've treated it just as ground. So get rid of in their views, in their eyes, the enemy, but that also means getting rid of all the infrastructure and the civilian population, and then just being able to hold the ground. And the argument is, well, that's not a very cute way of going about it, because if you look at what urban centres are, they're generally centres of political power or logistics or media or infrastructure, like a port or a rail hub, for example. So if you just go in there, if you have to take it by smashing the place up, then you can't use it for the purpose you wanted to take it in the first place. So there's almost no point in trying to launch an operation is going to cost you dearly if you can't then use the thing afterwards. It's a bit like the old phrase from Vietnam: we had to destroy the village to save it. It just doesn't make any sense. So a lot of this conference is talking about what are urban environments, why are they important, and how do you fight in them to preserve the reason you went in there in the first place. And one of the speakers is Colonel John Spencer, a US guy who's the chair of urban warfare studies at the Modern War Institute, and he's a specialist in urban warfare, basically. And he said that he's a civilian now, although he has a reservist commitment in the US, in California. But he was saying that at the start of the war in Ukraine, he started putting out some small tweets about what the local population can do to resist and defend and help save their country. And these were well received. And so he put them all together in a little sort of urban warfare resistors/defenders handbook. And that was picked up by a publisher in Kyiv and published hundreds of thousands of times and distributed to the population. And this is all very, very, we've seen this, the kind of hedgehogs, the metal poles, the sort of three-way pyramid type structures that you can place across a road to deny movement to, certainly road vehicles and armoured vehicles as well. So lots of little things that you can do. And the conference is saying, well, in the future, you can't look at an urban environment just as a sort of billiard table, flat piece of ground. The civilians have a massive vote, and they are not part of the problem necessarily, unless you make it so. But you have to operate in and amongst them. So if what's happening now in contemporary warfare is that the population, either through direct resistance in the case of following John Spencer's urban warfare handbook, for example, but also just uploading images on social media of where, as we've seen, where the Russians are, and here's an interesting photo of some air defense systems outside my house, and you can geolocate that. And we know that Ukraine have set up apps for the population to send in information and film and what have you. So if the civilians now are part of the defense, so the civilians are defenders and censors, that's an interesting concept, an interesting development, although you've got to think, well, how do you mobilize them? How do you train them? How do you organize them? And of course, you're then into the very difficult and thorny legal issues of, well, are they taking a legitimate role in military activity and are therefore relinquishing, under the Geneva Conventions, relinquishing their protections as a civilian and are therefore open to military response from the enemy? Are they legitimate targets, for example? So very interesting ideas about how does a population organize itself and resist on mass scale, particularly in the information environment with social media, and does that then mean that civilians are more drawn into the conflict and that therefore the infrastructure they're living and operating amongst is more of a target in and of itself? So really interesting ideas about what this information age means for warfare, what urban environments mean for warfare, and how the two mesh together. And we're seeing a lot of these issues playing out right in front of us in Ukraine. No one's got an answer yet, and hence we see the horrendous sort of death and destruction that's playing out in front of us. But this debate about what role the civilian has in future warfare and future resistance, if we're now talking that defense is not just the military activity, it's the whole of society, it's your societal resilience. Where do civilians sit in that, and at what point do they relinquish their protections under the Geneva Convention? It's an interesting point.
Thank you very much, Dom, for that. Roland, can I turn to you? You've written an absolutely fascinating piece of analysis for the Telegraph website. I'd recommend everybody goes to read it. You make lots of points. Let's start here. You write, the tactical gain, this is Putin capturing Luhansk, has brought almost no strategic advantage. Can you talk to us a little bit about why that's the case? Why does capturing Luhansk have no strategic advantage for the Russians?
It has it has a political advantage because the Russians, publicly they set out one of their war aims as the liberation of the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic, and now they can say, in fact, as Vladimir Putin has already said, we've achieved that one limited aim, now moving on to the next one. But the point of the Battle of Donbass at the beginning was meant to be this grand encirclement that was going to surround and then wipe out Ukraine's most formidable chunk of its army, the so-called Joint Forces Operation, which had been fighting along the old front line that had been there for 8 years. and it completely failed. I mean, first they tried this huge thing coming out from Izium and up in Zaporizhia region. Then they tried a more limited offensive further in. In the end, they had to do a tiny little encirclement, which eventually bit off Severodonetsk and Lysychansk after. I mean, I've lost count of the number of weeks. I mean, we're talking about a battle that went on probably longer than some of the battles of the Second World War. So the end result of this is Ukraine is still in the fight. They haven't won the war. That's what we mean by saying there's no real strategic advantage here. And it doesn't really put the Russians any closer to winning the war. That's the main point. So the victory, is it Pyrrhic? I think it's too early to tell because we don't really know how Russian losses stack up against their reserve to put things in, but it's certainly been costly.
Thanks, Roland. You also wrote that what happens next, the coming struggles for Sviazhsky, Slavyansk, Bakhmut, Kramatorsk, are going to be just as difficult for the Russian army. Could you tell us a little bit about these places? Why will it be just as difficult? How are the Ukrainians preparing to defend?
I mean, first of all, I think everything Dom said about the urban environment as a battle space, which the technical aspects of that he knows much more about than me, but that is very much what we've seen. These long drawn out battles in Ukraine in urban environments. Mariupol, horrendous destruction. Severodonetsk, flattened by artillery. Lysychansk, basically relinquished by the Ukrainians in advance. You're going to see the same kind of thing in these in places like Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. The Ukrainians have been expecting battles for Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, Bakhmut, literally for months. Since April, they've been saying, get the civilians out. We know that this place is going to look like Mariupol, and they are going to fight to defend in similar ways. These are really important cities, by the way. And so since Ukraine lost control of Donetsk, which is the big urban conglomeration, the big regional capital in 2014, this stretch of towns along the highway north of that. So you've got Kramatorsk, you've got Slavyansk, you've got a place called Druzhkivka, and then there's a parallel highway on the other side of a ridge. And there you've got Bakhmut. These are the major towns of Ukrainian-controlled Donetsk region. So the Ukrainians are going to fight absolutely tooth and claw for it, and they have dug in. And we could see them dug in when I was there back in May. It is going to be a hell of a fight. And as we've seen, as Don has quite rightly pointed out, the Russian approach is huge amounts of artillery, to push the Ukrainians back, and then they send in their infantry to occupy the ruins. And I can't see any of that being any different this time.
So turning to the Ukrainians, you write that Ukraine is starting to run out of time. Can you explain why?
Yeah, so there's two ways of looking at the Battle of Luhansk Oblast, which is now over. One is that it was a successful Ukrainian holding action, that it tied down the Russian army for a very long time. It prevented them from deploying forces elsewhere, and that has bought time. It's bought time for these Western Highmars rocket launchers to get in there. It's bought time for the Ukrainians to train new brigades. When I was speaking to Sergei Gaidai, the governor of Luhansk region, back in May, he was saying, look, yeah, I know people are dying. We know people are dying up there. We know it's horrible, but we've got to hold it as long as possible because we need to buy time for the coming counteroffensive, of which there was a lot of talk back in May. And that counteroffensive hasn't yet emerged. Will it emerge? I don't know. I have the feeling the Ukrainians have put a lot of their newly raised units straight into the front to hold back the Russians. So I'm not sure if these new brigades exist. They may do. But look, there's a much bigger battle going on of much more strategic importance, and that's the one for kind of public opinion in Western capitals. And I don't actually include London in this. I think the debate is pretty much over here. I think all sides of the House of Commons, all sides of society are pretty unanimous that this is a war that Ukraine must win. I don't think that is just, Boris Johnson just pushing things, for cynical domestic reasons, although, he may be exploiting it. I think that does reflect the consensus in the British establishment. That's not the case in America. That is not the case in Washington or Berlin or Paris. There are lots of people there, and you'll remember this opinion piece in the New York Times the other month, where people are saying, well, can Ukrainians really win? I think they've got to be realistic. We can't really beat the Russians. They're probably going to have to give up some land. I think we should tell the Ukrainians that they can't win. I don't think we should send them more rockets and missiles and weapons than they need, and so on. This is a really serious issue for the Ukrainians, and it is what the Russians are banking on for winning this war. So I think we're getting to the point where the Ukrainians need a. I mean, there's two comparisons from history. There's Saratoga in the American War of Independence, when the Americans defeated the Brits, and that convinced the French, okay, we'll be backing a winning horse here, and that is why the French started sending the support to the Americans, which ultimately won that war. And then the other comparison I would make is Goose Green in the Falklands War, which was infamously. A battle that wasn't really militarily necessary, but which Margaret Thatcher pushed for because, she needed it was really politically important to get a victory. And it cost a lot of men's lives, and it was a bloody fight. But if you look back at the history, despite it being, probably not militarily necessary, it was probably crucial in, convincing international opinion, convincing Washington, and others that, look, the Brits can win the Falklands. We're getting to the point where I think Ukraine needs something like that to convince those doubters.
Well, thank you very much for that, Roland. That was extensive. I think just what we needed. Just wondering, Dom and Francis, do you have questions for Roland as well? I've got more, but I thought I'd throw to you two.
Well, I just wanted to echo something that Roland was saying, and I'm sure he'll have a comment on it. So we've got a piece going up tonight from All Souls historian Sir Hugh Strawn. And he argues that, similarly, in a sense, that for the reasons that Roland was just talking about, the Ukraine is arguably running out of time. So essentially, his argument is that for all of these NATO commitments made at Madrid last week, this doesn't really help Ukraine. It's good future-proofing. Ensuring that this doesn't become a sort of Third World War type situation, or that doesn't give Putin the ammunition to invade other territories, but it doesn't assist the Ukrainian capacity to resist. So Finland and Sweden's acceptance to NATO doesn't really help in the short term, he argues. He makes the point that sanctions aren't really working on Russia perhaps in the way that we thought it would cripple them in the short term, that they've been able to do certain things to the economy, some creative accounting that has sort of shored up the ruble. He sort of talks about how Ukraine effectively is facing more severe economic problems than Russia. And saying that if Ukraine is defeated, there is actually no way back for it. If Russia faces defeat on the battlefield, as it already has, then as it's been shown, it can replenish its supplies and come back. But a major defeat for Ukraine will be, absolutely disastrous for the reasons that Roland was talking about, not only in terms of the support that's provided for Ukraine, but also, its reserves arguably are more limited. So effectively, he says that NATO is committed to an attritional stalemate in Ukraine, and if Ukraine wants to win, it has to do far more, and that will be obviously require more support in terms of military supplies, etc., to Ukraine long term, that we are not currently seeing. So quite a sort of pessimistic piece as things stand, but one that I think echoes the political points that Roland is making, that Ukraine has more to lose by military defeats than Russia do. But perhaps looking at it more optimistically, as we were talking about on the podcast last week, the great unanswered question is whether an attritional war favours Ukraine or whether it favours Russia. Whether the Ukrainian morale, which continues to be high despite everything that they have faced, whether that will have a longer term beneficial impact for the Ukrainian forces. as I say, there's the jury is out on that, and there's considerable debate that we talked about last week. Sir Patrick Sanders, of course, made this point that for him, he was arguing that Russia tend to start wars badly and improve. So I think we can assume that seems to be more of the British Army's view, that if the West is to defeat Russia, it needs to be now rather than later. And of course, also the analysis by Kissinger plays into this that we talked about last week as well, because from his perspective, he was saying that if the West were able to effectively stop, and Ukraine, of course, were able to stop Putin more or less in not taking any more territory than that he has already acquired, then that would be considered a victory for Ukraine and for the West. And so obviously there'll be many people who would disagree with that. They say that it's far too risky to allow Putin to have any military successes whatsoever, because of the message that sends geopolitically around the world, and also that he'll be able to spin to his people. But this is something that no doubt will be of continuing significance, particularly in the analysis in Washington and Paris, as they sort of say, well, perhaps that in order for there to be peace in Europe, there will need to be some sort of concessions given to Russia, and that we can spin him being stopped here, and perhaps holding Crimea, Donetsk and Luhansk, and that being enough for a peace deal to be signed. So there's so much relevant to all this, and that's before you even bring in the energy and the cost of living things. I was talking earlier about Norway, and obviously Norway aren't a member of the European Union, but they have a very close relationship, and sort of all of these interconnections that are having a big impact on the overall picture of the unity of Europe. And so I'd say that this period is really, really crucial for defining how this is perceived, and how much support Ukraine will be offered in the coming weeks and months, because certainly it will have a huge significance. And will we see that counterattack that Roland was alluding to, that the Ukrainians were talking about in May? If we don't, then that may be of severe consequences for Western unity on this issue.
Thank you very much, Francis, for that. Dom and Roland, I don't know if you want to come in on that, but Roland, I just ask, could you just tell us a little bit about when was the first time you were in Luhansk, and how long have you reported from there, and what should our listeners know about the region and the people?
I was first in Luhansk region in 2014, during the initial war. Luhansk region, well, like all of Donbass, like the Donetsk region, it's heavily industrialized. It's very poor. It's got a sense of, Luhansk region is poorer than Donetsk region. That's the first thing you notice. So, in 2014, I was spending a lot of time in Donetsk region. I got a lot of friends in Donetsk and so on. And when you crossed the border, the kind of regional border, you saw things getting poorer and more desperate and kind of depressed. And I'm talking about, this is before the war. I remember one time we went into this town called Pervomaisky, which is opposite Popasna. Basically, the Russians and so-called separatists controlled that. The Ukrainians controlled Popasna. They were shelling each other back and forth. It was horrible. I remember riding in there and being, goodness me, this looks pretty grim. My driver from Donetsk was like, it was always grim. This isn't the war. It's just it's a pretty tough place, really, all in all. The war has changed a lot, obviously. The 8 years of war, it was divided. There was a front line, and there was kind of investment directed on the Ukrainian side in an effort to kind of win hearts and minds and things like that. So some of the roads were pretty good. I started the war in Severodonetsk, this war. I was there when the invasion began. Kind of had this kind of optimistic, buzzy, kind of quite nice feel to it. At that point, gone now, obviously.
The only thing I'll offer, if I could jump in here briefly, is that Roland's idea there that Ukraine need to provide a tactical win to show that they are capable to for their own domestic morale as well as to shore up international support, I think is really interesting and pertinent. And Jack Watling, the senior fellow from RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, big think tank here in London, he made the point earlier on in one of the sessions this morning. He was making that very point, and he said that in his view, the battle for Severodonetsk, which, as we've said before, conferred very, very little tactical advantage to either side. But he was suggesting that was the battle that Ukraine had decided to fight for those reasons. And they put a lot of personnel, a lot of equipment into that salient, into that pocket, in order to try and achieve that victory over Russia in that city. Now, I think it's a little bit of both. I think there's far be it for me to go toe-to-toe with Jack Watling on his analysis, but I think it's partly that, and it was partly the reasons that we've been describing elsewhere, that it was very helpful to get Russia to expend its ammunition and material. So I'm just whispering because the next session started, and I'm just trapped out here, obviously between the lifts and the loos. So great, it's glorious stuff. But yeah, so I think that point of Jack Watling, that battle that Roland described, was run out in Severodonetsk. I think it's quite interesting. More analysis required there, but this idea that something big is required quite soon from Ukraine is gaining ground.
I mean, looking at where this goes now, just quickly. I mean, there's a lot of talk about the Highmars deliveries. I've just been speaking to one of Ukraine's former defence ministers. He said, great bit of kit. Not enough. Now, you'll have seen over the past several days these deep strikes against ammunition dumps, command centres deep in the Russian rear, which we think have been carried out by these Highmars units. The Ukrainians never actually say, what has done what for operational security reasons. I think that is what we're seeing is this Ukrainian attempt to stop the Russian advance, and I think because they don't have enough Western weapons to go toe-to-toe with the Russians, they can't match them gun for gun. What they seem to be doing is trying to throttle that logistical chain of shells that is supplying the Russian artillery machine. So we think the Russians are firing off something like 20,000 rounds a day. All right, so you've got to bring in a lot, most of it by rail. So I think this is going to be the test over the next few months, right? Are the Russians forced to stop? Does their advance in Donetsk region run into the sand because they're just not getting enough shells to the front to replicate what they did in Luhansk region? And if that works, then the Ukrainians have stopped the Russian advance. The next question is the counteroffensive, and that's a whole different ballpark, and we're talking about tanks and infantry tactics and God knows what else. To take the offensive is going to be a different thing.
Well, thank you very much, Dom Nicholls, Roland Oliphant and Francis Dearnley. I think we're probably towards the end of our time now, so I'll just ask you for your final thoughts and what should our listeners be thinking to and looking for in the next few days?
Well, from me, it's still the focus on Lysychansk. It's still very, very soon, too soon after the fall of Lysychansk to analyse it properly, no matter what Putin says. I think keep an eye on that. That will dictate what happens next. I think if the central and southern groupings, the fighters that Putin said was in that pocket, if they are given time to rest, that will be interesting. I think that is what they should do. They need to regenerate. They need to build up their force again before they try and push west. But how long they will be given to rest is an interesting point. But also this focus on the others, so those in the north around Kharkiv and the Russian forces in the south around Kherson, this idea that, well, okay, guys, it's now over to you. You've got to do your bit. That will be interesting to watch, because don't forget that we think they've had a lot of their prime equipment and fighters stripped out for the fight in the east. So whether or not they're even able to push on in the north and south will be very interesting. But to see where the Russian forces push next, I think will tell us a lot about the next phase of this war.
I think that is interesting. I think it's this battle for public opinion. I mean, I think if the West wants to put its money where its mouth is, and it actually wants Ukraine to win this war, actually wants Ukraine to win this war, it needs to do a couple of things. One of them is massively expand its industrial production. It basically needs to outproduce Russia, and it needs to start funneling stuff to Ukraine. I mean, not kind of like, here's half a dozen French howitzers, here's half a dozen American rocket launchers. It needs, World War II style factories working 3 shifts kind of thing, because it is a war of attrition. That's what's going on. If we see the West do that, that does mean they're serious. If not, the Russians are going to be watching that as well, and they're going to think, well, the West is saying this, but they're not actually acting on it. That's one thing. The other thing, I mean, don't underestimate how absolutely brutal this battle these past few months have been for the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainians keep their casualty figures close to their chest, but they were talking about 100 guys lost a day. You just had to kind of pass through the field hospitals back in May to see what an artillery war does, and that really worries me about the number of guys who've been lost and the impact on morale. I still think Ukrainian morale is very, very high, but I don't think we should underestimate just the huge amount of life lost and how that's going to impact things further down the line.
If I could just, on this question of Roland was talking about around public perception and the need for victory, Roland gave two historical examples of where that victory was achieved, and it arguably changed the course of two wars. I know we have a lot of American listeners, and of course in the American Civil War, the South fought relying on there to be some sort of decisive victory against the North that would eventually mean that Britain came in on their side and they would, in an attritional war, would eventually beat the North. They never achieved that victory. Gettysburg was arguably the final nail of the coffin in 1863, and whilst the war went on for another 2 years, they could never regain the strategic momentum, the momentum geopolitically around the world, that the idea that the Confederacy was losing. Now, of course, I'm not comparing in any way the values of Ukraine with the values of the Confederacy, but I just talk about it. These are the risks here for Ukraine, that if you don't get that victory, then it can have severe ramifications, particularly if they are reliant on it, and we don't know the scale of which they are reliant on it at this present moment. But I just wanted to end with the Ukrainian Prime Minister commented on Monday that the estimated cost of rebuilding Ukraine at present, and of course the war is not yet over, is $750 billion. And President Zelensky, in his nightly address, commented on this and said that this quote, "This is Russia's attack on everything that is of value to you and me. Therefore, the reconstruction of Ukraine is not just a local project, not a project of one nation, but a joint task of the entire democratic world." And I just wanted to end by we wrote a leader yesterday saying that whenever this war ends, who's going to pay for this? Is it going to be Western taxpayers? Is it going to be a Marshall Plan style, where the United States particularly invests heavy amounts of money, gives heavy amounts of money in order to rebuild this country? Or, as we argued for in this leader, should this be the responsibility of the Russian state and Russian assets that were frozen by sanctions? So interestingly, Canada has just passed a law giving its government the right to confiscate and sell seized Russian assets. And perhaps we should be more seriously thinking in the West about doing the same here in Europe, about using all of those billions of pounds that have been frozen of Russian wealth in putting it into a fund that will mean that when this war is finally over, that there will be a lot of money there from the Russians themselves that will be paying for the damage that they have wrought on an innocent country.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly with us by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Sophie Coe.